All right, we have a motion and a second. Commissioner Lukey here.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on this because as it stands, I currently will not be in support of the motion. And I'm going to explain my reasons why, because I feel like it's something that hasn't been addressed. And nobody in this room, or at least nobody who testified, lives in the area of the city that apparently I live in, at least based on the addresses, unless you're all lying. And so I just want to talk about how I feel this might impact North Minneapolis, because a lot of the benefits you talk about are not going to be realized in the same way in my neck of the woods. So, I want to say I'm all for reducing automobile usage in the city. I think it's a great idea. I think even something along this lines is a great idea. I think that the 100% and 50% amounts of are too high. That is my feeling, and here's why. Aside from the fact that it still mandates that we have garages and parking spaces for single family occupancies and duplexes, but suddenly if you have a triplex, you don't. It seems a little odd to me. But for North Minneapolis, I would say a large amount of our population is low-income families. And a lot of the low-income families, the one thing they have less of than money is time. And if they have children and they have to get them to daycare and to school and get to their jobs, odds are their jobs aren't as flexible as people in a professional environment who make more money. So if they aren't able to somehow bike or walk their child to 3 or 4 children, I should say, to 3 or 4 different locations before getting themselves to work, that means they can't work. We just made life more difficult for them. Whether or not they take the bus does not go all the places that you need to go. Also, all the amenities you guys talk about you can walk to meet your daily needs. We live in a food desert there. And quite frankly, we also live in a transit desert. We were promised streetcar and LRT and all these wonderful things that every other place in the city seems to be getting, and we don't get it. When you talk about car to go, I just did a snapshot today of where we're at. If you count north and northeast together, there were 65 cars available. That's almost the same amount as we're downtown, which was 63. Or if you count all of south, 180 cars available. You have more amenities available. If you even do Nice Ride, we have 8 Nice Ride stations in north. You have 33 downtown, and you have 42 in south. The ability to get around and be mobile in an area of the city like this is not as easy for people in north as it is for people in other areas. So I just want to say, to go to zero is going to put an unfair burden on people with children. That's how they're going to move to the suburbs, by maybe Brooklyn Center, Brooklyn Park, areas where they can have a car and get around. I also want to say that you're right, the market will bear out. This isn't prohibiting people from putting parking in, which is why we see really high-end development come through that try to get more parking than what we'd recommend as a city. Why? Because it's an amenity. Parking is an amenity that some people have the luxury to afford, and that's great. Do you know what will happen in North if we don't require some parking? We won't get any parking, which great, but we won't get anything in its place either. The nice landscaping, the nice amenities, the wonderful things that we see all over the city and other multifamily development doesn't happen there. There's nothing here in this ordinance incenting that kind of amenity added. So all we're doing is adding more density, oddly enough, probably called workforce housing, in the area of the city with the least number of jobs available. So we're pretty much creating a situation where there aren't basic amenities, and which I think furthers the inequities in the city. All of a sudden, we will see nothing, in my opinion, but multifamily development with no parking in North, whereas other areas of the city will be able to provide amenities. Maybe they won't do the amount of parking we require now, but they'll do some, just like William Wells was saying. His example, he'd still have parking. That's great. In North, we wouldn't. We'd be seeing a bare lot. Okay, so all of a sudden then, we have areas of the city that for the next 50 years are going to be at a bit of a disadvantage to other areas that are able to provide those amenities. We've furthered the inequity for North than we would for every other area of the city, making it harder for people to live and work there. It's kind of creating a race to the bottom in my mind. I also want to say that I'm glad that this doesn't go down to single family and duplex development, because also in North, a lot of times when developers do the bare minimum, they don't do parking pads back when they didn't have to do them. They didn't do garages. So what would happen? People would pull their car up right next to the building. Great. We have oil leaking onto our soils. Wonderful condition. When we made people add them, that was a step in the right direction, because when crime happens to vehicles in other areas of the city, we pay our deductible, we grumble about it, we move on. When it happens to people in North, if they don't have insurance, they are completely out of their means of transportation, or they have to scrape together enough money to pay that deductible. Having something like a garage or some protected means of protecting their vehicle allows them to have a more reliable means of transportation if their jobs aren't locally held, which most, like I said, there aren't a lot of jobs there. So I just want to say I am all in favor of an ordinance like this. I personally would change the numbers from 3 to 50 to say 3 to 25. I'd change the 51 and up to say 26 and up. I'd change the percentages for the 3 to 25 to 75% and 60% respectively, and for the 26 and up from 60% to 25%. Still drastic reductions from the 10% we allow now, but I think providing some parking still allows for that balance and a chance for us to still achieve equitable situations with the rest of the city instead of furthering that divide. So that is why I'm not anti reductions in parking. I'm not anti-biking. I think it's awesome. But I just think it needs to be fair for those who can't afford it as an amenity, which is what it's going to be if we do this. Thank you.
All right, Commissioner Bender.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I'm the author of this change, and of course I'm very supportive. I wanted to talk a little bit about why I brought this forward. Our parking requirements today have a number of unintended consequences. And I hear about these consequences from my constituents, and I know that my colleagues do as well. Our parking requirements drive up the cost of housing. Even when we see buildings where people are paying separately for their parking, we know that they're not paying the full cost of those very expensive, often underground parking ramps, and that all of the people in the building, whether they're renters or condo owners, are paying the cost of that parking that we have required. When I ask architects and developers that are coming through the planning commission process how they decided how many parking spaces to put in their buildings, they're responding that we're just trying to meet the city's minimum requirements. They're not even doing the market studies that would show them how much parking is being demanded by the market. Our parking requirements also drive architecture. They result in these buildings that actually I hear a lot of negative feedback about. And I mean, there's other reasons that we're seeing, the same sort of building with a concrete parking ramp with 6 stories of stick construction above. That's kind of a typical proposal that we see. But our parking requirements are one of the reasons why. Because when you start designing your building from the number of parking spaces you must provide and you put that in a parking ramp, it starts to design the building. And I don't think that's right. I think that our buildings should allow for more creativity. And I think we should allow for the kinds of buildings, like the picture that was shown by someone who spoke today. My constituents tell me that they love the old brick apartment buildings in my ward. But we don't allow those to be built today. And this is just one of the regulations that stand in the way of those buildings that people like to see. It's also one of a series of changes I'm bringing forward that they're really small changes now. If we completely eliminated parking requirements citywide, we wouldn't see an immediate change in the market. We wouldn't see banks suddenly giving financing to developers. The developers aren't asking for this change. In fact, most of them are saying they don't really need it because they can't get financing to build projects that have less than 0.7 parking spaces per unit in most of the city. But over time, over the next several decades as our city grows, this small change today will make a huge change in our housing stock. It will make a huge change in our level of affordability. And it will allow for us to be more proactive than the other cities across the country that are right now in a crisis of affordability. We have the chance now to make the changes that we need to allow for these small scale neighborhood projects that will provide the naturally affordable housing for people who make, a regular income in our city. This is our chance to be forward thinking. And so I think this is a great change. It is not a parking maximum. I considered that and talked to my colleagues about that. I'll say to my planning commissioner colleagues, I think if we had imposed a maximum on parking spaces, we would see a lot of variance requests, and I didn't want to do that to everyone. I don't think we're quite there yet in Minneapolis. I would support a parking maximum in my ward, but again, I think that we would see a lot of pushback from the development community on that, a lot of pushback in general from that, and so I think this reasonable small change is one moving in the right direction.
All right, and Commissioner Gitzelman, you have a comment?
Yes, I just wanted to just to mention that I will also not be supporting this text amendment as it is written. Certainly, it's not on the basis that I support the construction of excess parking here in the city of Minneapolis. It's certainly not based on the idea that I wouldn't support the promoting of more affordable housing, and it definitely isn't that I don't support more use of public transportation. I live in the city. I own a car. I'm lucky to live on the Blue Line, though, and so when I walk out of here tonight, I'm going to ride the train home. It's really based upon the fact that I'm just not convinced that that the text amendment, at least as it's written right now, won't really put the burden of parking congestion on other residents in the city, some of which who are here who spoke in opposition to this tonight, and I can't see how that's a fair burden to place on those existing residents, and so primarily for those reasons, I will not be supporting this text amendment.
All right. Commissioner Forney, did you have a comment?
Thank you. I got really excited when I read the text amendment. What I was reading in it was about housing affordability, and that so much of housing is not affordable because of a requirement to have parking. And so to eliminate the requirement for parking and to therefore make things more affordable, or affordable rents, seem logical to me, okay? But hearing what the staff report is, hearing all of you talking, I'm hearing that this is not a housing affordability amendment. This is a transit orientation amendment. And I think it's defeating the purpose of housing affordability. I feel the tool of limiting parking needs to be hooked directly to housing affordability. So if developers do create affordable housing, then they can apply for eliminating parking. That to me seems like a more equitable thing. But then when you start thinking about that, then are we only driving affordable housing close to transit? And therefore, are we creating new ghettos? I feel that the way that the text amendment is presently written, I feel as if we are providing the opportunity for unintended consequences. Therefore, I will be voting against it.
All right. Commissioner Gagnon.
I just wanted to speak a little bit to the people getting their kids to daycare, to school, to so forth and so on. And I know there's been a lot of great conversation around universal pre-K, around early childhood programs, and also, especially for K-8 students, they do have school buses, but we've also been really working in Minneapolis Public Schools. If you attend our early childhood program, some of which are full day, and that we really are trying to make more full day access, we do bus kids to and from their home. And so, and that's where school readiness monies is different than early childhood, because you don't necessarily get a bus with school readiness support. So I think that's something that the city, that the state is looking at, because transportation equity is a huge thing. But I also, I hear what Alyssa is saying in that North Minneapolis, there's also sparsity of things to walk to. I'm fortunate to live in an area that I can walk to everything. That's not the case. I work in North Minneapolis. You cannot walk to everything. So that is a very real thing. I think that has to be a conversation that coincides with this transportation and home price affordability conversation. We can't have one without the other. I will be supporting this, but I do think it is imperative that we also have the conversation around sparsity in different parts of the city, that it's not walkable. And there's either a perception or reality of safety also. And even the choice system within schools, kids are going all over the place to schools. So they're not necessarily going to their community school. All of those things are huge issues. I do think there are also a lot of zoning. Ryan's been trying to explain to me, all the yellow doesn't apply to this because some of the yellow doesn't apply to this because of single family dwellings and so forth. So I do think there will still be a lot of home flexibility in this amendment. But those other conversations have to happen in the city because we are leaving out a huge group of folks. We're just assuming everybody's the same. Everyone's not uptown for sure. So that conversation has to continue.
And Commissioner Kronzer.
Thank you, President Brown. I will be supporting this amendment, and I have three reasons I wrote down late last night, and I'm sure there's another dozen more I could state. But this amendment is allowing for the option of less parking. It's not mandating less parking. I think that needs to be very clearly stated. This is not a mandate for no parking. This is leaving the option open to allow less parking in new developments and some existing developments. It also could allow for smaller scale infill developments to happening. We saw a project recently, 3 sites in South Minneapolis, small parking lot and back. I think this amendment will help encourage smaller scale developments, maybe even 2- and 3-story newer developments, and maybe less 5- and 6-story developments. That is definitely yet to be seen, but this will not lessen that. And also, this could also improve transit service over time. With transit and density, it's a chicken and egg thing. The more density, the better the transit service. The more transit service, the more people ride the bus or the trains. So, over time, we could see more transit service, higher frequency, more than just what's out there today as well. So I will be supporting the amendment.
All right. Commissioner Slack, do you have another comment? Please. All right.
Well, I will also be supporting this text amendment. I think long term it's going to provide a lot of benefits that we're not seeing now. So in the short term, I don't see that we'll see much in the way of really how it's going to affect development proposals. What I do see is that it's going to create and take us to the next step of becoming a more sustainable city. I've spent some time in the last couple of weeks since we actually saw this first account and tried to go through essentially the last 9 to 12 months of development proposals that we saw. And obviously we didn't see any development proposals where a developer asked for complete reduction in parking. We saw quite a few development proposals where there was a reduced number of parking, but it was a limited number of parking, and a lot of those requests were really based on site specific. So the site's too small, the site's oriented the wrong way, yada yada yada. So I actually, I do development work, and we've had a couple of testimony from a couple of architects and developers, and parking really is driven by financing. Parking is really driven by the market, and in the short term, I actually don't see how this is really going to affect what we see on a day-to-day basis from a development review standpoint. And so I do think, though, long-term implications of this are going to be very beneficial for the city.
Right. Is there any other comment? I have a few words to add, and I would like to thank the staff. I think they did a very good job of laying out the issues. I do want to point out that part of what is driving this is that we have seen a change in the trend over the last several years in automobile ownership, and I think we do need to be prepared to adapt to that. Younger people are owning fewer and fewer cars. People are waiting longer to buy a car. People are selling their cars when they move to a different place. So I think we've seen a lot of evidence that our current 1-to-1 parking ratio is too high in a lot of places. We've seen variance requests and other requests related to the amount of parking that's provided with new residential construction. So I do think it's important that we evolve with some of those trends, and I do feel that this is one less barrier to producing more affordable housing in the city. Over the last couple of years, a lot of the new construction we've seen has been more luxury type products right around downtown. And that's fine. I think it's great that we have people who want to live in the city, and I think the more people we have, the more sustainable city we have with a more stable tax base, more vibrancy. I think it benefits all of us. But I do have a concern that we haven't seen a lot of more mid-scale residential development or moderately priced development. And if parking isn't always included in that, that can certainly reduce the cost of construction. So I think that's another important consideration.